things that AARO does is high integrity analysis, as I've said. This chart represents the trend analysis of all the cases in AARO's holdings, right, to date. What you'll see on the left is a histogram of all of our reported sightings as a function of altitude. So most of our sightings occur in the 15 to 25,000 foot range, and that is ultimately because that's where a lot of our aircraft are. On the far right upper corner, you'll see a breakout of the morphologies of all of the UAP that are reported. Over half, about 52% of what's been reported to us are round orb spheres. The rest of those break out into all kinds of different other shapes. The gray box is essentially there's no data on what its shape is. Either it wasn't reported or the sensor did not collect it. The bottom map is a heat map of all reporting areas across the globe that we have available to us. What you'll notice is that there is a heavy, what we call collection bias, both in altitude and in geographic location. That's where all of our sensors exist. That's where our training ranges are. That's where our operational ranges are. That's where all of our platforms are. In the middle, what we have done is reduce the most typically reported UAP characteristics to these fields, mostly round, mostly 1 to 4 meters, white, silver, translucent, metallic, 10,000 to 30,000 feet, with apparent velocities from stationary to Mach 2. No thermal exhausts usually detected. We get intermittent radar returns, we get intermittent radio returns, and we get intermittent thermal signatures. That's what we're looking for and trying to understand what that is.
Today, we're joined by Marik von Rennenkampff, a former U.S. Department of Defense official and State Department analyst. We explore the science behind UAP classification, why shape data varies across agencies, and what those inconsistencies might actually reveal. Marik shares insights on national security implications, the growing role of private industry in UAP research, and how to move beyond media hype to spark serious public debate. We also ask, why is the mainstream media, aside from NewsNation, largely backed away from covering UAPs? What's changed? Join us as we get rebelliously curious. Marik, thank you so much for joining me on Rebelliously Curious. We've been going back and forth trying to get you on this podcast for a little bit now. You are so busy from doing UAP data analysis, from working obviously formerly defense, and then you were a former analysis for the U.S. Department of the State as well, and also being on Skywatcher recently. So thank you for joining me.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's a true pleasure and honor to be here with you.
That's awesome. So let's go back a little bit in your work history. I'm so fascinated by that. And I'm always fascinated with people that just work in defense as well. I think maybe I was doing that in a former life. Who knows? The more I talk about UFOs, the more I get interested in national security every single day. And I find it fascinating. So how did you find yourself in the U.S. Department of Defense and then doing analysis with the U.S. Department of State?
Yeah. So long story short, I was a political appointee at the Pentagon. So I came in kind of through the political pipeline. A lot of people don't know, but there's a major turnover in political appointments, about 3,000 or 4,000 positions every time a new administration comes in DC. There's pretty significant churn. It's not just the folks at the top. There's quite a few folks at the kind of the mid and staff level that come in with appointees. And at the Pentagon, I work directly for the Secretary of Defense. So the head honcho at the Pentagon, the civilian who oversees the military. And my role was what's called advanced. So I would travel ahead of the Secretary anytime he was on the road. So I would be part of a team that would scout out locations. So if the secretary was going to, let's say, Egypt to meet with his counterparts and conduct, meetings with troops or whatever, I would be on the ground ahead of time. We'd do all the motorcade routes. We would kind of scope everything out so that when he landed, we knew exactly where he was going. We knew the schedule. We knew how everything runs. It was a ton of travel, fascinating experience. I did that for a couple of years. Met some just incredible people. So we'd work with the U.S. Embassy overseas, and they would support our trip. And did 6 missions to Afghanistan, 1 to Iraq. I mean, you mentioned it. I was all over the world. Just a great experience. I left the Pentagon, went to grad school out in Monterey, California. Really a superb program. It's not one of the heavy hitters on the East Coast like the Harvards or GW in DC, but it's a very niche kind of focused national security program at this grad school. And my focus there was terrorism and weapons of mass destruction. So 2 distinct subject matters, but also there, God forbid, but there could be a nexus there. And from there, I went to the State Department as a contract analyst working on counter weapons of mass destruction, counter WMD stuff. And I focused specifically on chemical weapons, and this is in the time frame when ISIS or ISIL was mixing up some really nasty stuff in Iraq and Syria. So we were trying to cut off the precursor chemicals, basically the chemicals that are used to then eventually concoct really nasty stuff like mustard, sulfur mustard, and chlorine and stuff like that. So yeah, had nothing to do with UAP while I was in the government. I did not think about this topic. I truly thought it was squarely tinfoil hat territory. I never spent time thinking about UFOs. I missed the big 2017 New York Times story, which I think most people are aware, just as a testament to how much I did not think about this topic. I missed that story when it came out, and I only got into it when Commander Dave Fravor, who I think many of your audience will know, was one of 3 naval aviators who observed the well-known Tic Tac shaped craft off the coast of California in 2004. He was on Joe Rogan, and I'd worked with naval aviators and pilots when I was at the Pentagon. I knew the type, and Fravor's the real deal. And from there, I was hooked. So that's the long and short story of kind of my government time, and also my move into the UAP topic.
It's unbelievable. What a great job. First of all, traveling around the world, like someone who loves to travel. And when I was doing more public relations in that space, you do the same thing. You go out and you're looking at locations and you're making sure everybody's okay. I've been in Tanzania, traveling in Ethiopia with media. And so I loved it. So I can't even imagine doing that consistently. Exhausting, but such a great way to see the world, and such a great way to see different cultures.
110%. I was incredibly lucky. And I was in my mid 20s. I was young, so I love the frenetic pace. I love the intensity of it. I volunteered for all the challenging trips just because it's an experience. So to your point, no, I really loved it. I still really enjoy traveling. And I was just very fortunate to be in a very interesting gig and to see some interesting, some very interesting things. I was in Iraq at the very, very end for the end of mission ceremony when we formally left. And that was, after a pretty brutal war. We don't need to get into the politics of it, but I think everybody can agree that it was just a brutal war to finally to be there at the very end, and among the last troops that were there was it's just one of those moments that you just kind of pinch yourself and you can say I was there.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. And I think you're the right person to be doing what you're doing now with UAP. You've traveled the world, you've spoken to so many different people, from, I would say, just the general average person to different diplomats, all the way now to looking at like chemical warfare, right? Which unfortunately with nuclear is very attached to UAP. When I go back to warfare, and that's kind of just what buzzed in my head, and I wrote down rules of war. Doing that job, working with, mass destruction, Were you ever involved with, following along with the rules of war, depending, and then what kind of chemical warfare they were using around the world? Because, we're seeing it now, right? We see it all the time. We're seeing it happen in multiple different countries where the rules of war are not followed. And chemicals for sure are used for obviously for defense purposes.
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's a kind of a core of more of the kind of the academic side of my background. There are international conventions and treaties against chemical warfare, biological warfare, nuclear weapons, and the development of all of these terrible weapons. That said, my focus when I was at state was on non-state actors, so terrorist groups who, believe it or not, are not bound by international treaties. They'll do anything right in their ability or within the realm of their capabilities to inflict maximum trauma, violence on their victims. So, in terms of rules, that there are no norms or rules when it comes to, generally speaking, when it comes to these terrorist groups. Thankfully, ISIS was fairly resoundingly defeated as a large kind of territory governing entity. It still exists in pockets in parts of the Middle East, and it's spread to Africa and other parts of the world have offshoots of ISIS. But right, as a kind of a significant, again, territory holding entity that is and was capable of creating some generally crude chemical weapons, but still, very, very nasty stuff. Luckily, that threat is more or less gone at this point, but who knows how things can reconstitute themselves in the future.
Oh, for sure. And now looking to the UAP topic, nuclear is such a huge conversation with UAP, right? It has been consistently. We see UAPs over different types of installations, defense bases. We see them. There's such a major correlation. You know so much about this from a political perspective too. How do you see UAP connected to nuclear then? Because you would know better than I would. I will look at reports and data, but you were first in this for a very long time.
Yeah, and now that you bring it up, it's fascinating. I haven't thought about this since I got into the UAP topic, but a big chunk of my academic work was focused on nuclear non-proliferation and just and had a big focus on that element of the WMD the broader umbrella of WMD, and never once did UAP come up. And now that I look back on it, to your point, the connection, that nexus between UAP encounters and nuclear assets, and that's not limited, right? That's not limited to nuclear weapons. You see activity around power plants, around nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, and now that I think about it, it's just shocking to me how I dove head first into this stuff academically, and not once did this come up at all, and it's just shocking to me. It is truly shocking. But yes, to your point, I mean, if you go through the historical record, the documented incidents, I can think of a number that many people know. The Malmstrom incident, I think it was in 1967, but Minot Air Force, 1966, F.E. Warren Air Force Base, 1965. I'm just rattling stuff off, but these are documented sightings. This is not just somebody speaking potentially off the cuff. These are you look back at some of these incidents, and it's even more interesting than that. I'll say I'll just use one example, and that's 1965 over the nuclear missile silos at F.E. Warren Air Force Base, and those are spread out over Wyoming, Colorado, and I think into Nebraska. I'm sure somebody will correct me, but there's these remarkable documents that lay out. 150 service members saw. I think they had exact numbers, like something like almost 200 objects over the course of 3 or 4 nights, and over kind of hovering and flying over these nuclear missile silos out kind of in these rural parts of Colorado. And here's where in Nebraska, and here's where it gets really, really interesting. the reports read exactly like what we're seeing with these drone incursions over all these military bases, objects with bright flashing lights, hovering, moving around, moving in formation. Obviously, there were no DJI drones in 1965. Nothing, made in China. That little quadcopter. So, when I look back at the long history of the UFOs and nukes, the Nexus, it is perhaps the strongest, from an evidentiary basis in terms of what we have in documents, that I think is perhaps the strongest link that I can think of. It's just fascinating that with my career, certainly my academic background, kind of came full circle on that.
For sure. It led you to UAP. You had no
Yeah,
choice, I think, Merrick. I think you had to get into this.
exactly.
It led you here. I would say, looking at SCU, the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies, they had a report that came out, I believe, about a year or two ago that was around the intention studies. But there was two sections of it. But the first part focused on a subsection, I believe, between 1960s and I forget that 1970s. I have to double check those dates. But it looked at just military and nuclear activity connected to UAP and bases, and then looked at all the correlations, and then later tried to come up with an intention and what that meant. But one of the most interesting points in that report that I found out, and I wonder if you know this and you can maybe speak to it from anything that you've seen in data, is that when they looked at different types of activity on bases or anywhere near new nuclear install warfare or anything like that, they noticed that the UAP would observe for a period of time, but historically, it would never go back to the same location.
Huh.
Right? That's what I went
That's
out of.
interesting.
Right, out of all the information that the report was amazing, and the data analysis was so well done. But I really took that and I went, I wonder why. Like,
Huh.
yeah, out of all of the from that history point, why did it never go back? Was it doing some kind of reconnaissance? Did it have enough data? It doesn't mean that the nuclear program stopped. It just
Right.
stopped coming back. Have you seen that before?
That's interesting. So is the hypothesis there that if these, right, let's assume these are NHI craft, is the hypothesis maybe that they're doing some kind of survey and they say, okay, we've got everything in area A, let's move on to area B. That is interesting. That's very interesting. I don't know. Yeah. I mean, the only thing I can think of that it might run somewhat counter to that, depending on how you feel about the drone story. But I just referenced these really bizarre incidents in 1965 over F.E. Warren Air Force Base. In 2019 and 2020, some of your viewers or listeners may know, but there was a series of just truly, truly bizarre, quote unquote, drone incursions that lasted several weeks over rural Colorado, Nebraska, Ohio, and Wyoming in areas that in some cases were adjacent to these nuclear missile silos that were visited in 1965. So it depends on how you view the more recent incidents. If you actually think they're drones, then there's some validity to these visits not recurring, but there could be. That is a fascinating it's a fascinating hypothesis and observation that I need to dive into more. So thank you for
Yeah.
raising that. I
Oh,
appreciate
for
that.
sure. Yeah. I just thought it was so interesting when I was looking
Yeah.
at the report and I was talking to other people that were working on the report. And I was like, it's so great. And SCU does really, really wonderful work. I find when it comes to analysis with different groups and writing white papers and just submitting
Yeah.
scientific analysis on UAP as much as they possibly can.
Yeah.
So when you're
Can I
looking
just go
at,
back to that really quickly,
yes,
just because
please go
I
right
just
ahead.
thought of
Yeah.
something. I and this is going to kind of stretch the limits of exactly what happened in what year, but I believe there were reported incidents in 1967 at Malmstrom, which is the kind of the well-known Robert Salas and co. when there was an alleged shutdown. Um, I do remember, and this is actually very well, I really encourage all of your listeners and viewers to look up, just go to Google and type in Washington Post, what were those mysterious craft? And that'll link you to a story from 1979, but it reports on a series of incursions in 1975 that are just truly astounding. And these are all documented in, again, US government documents. And I believe some of those incidents, if memory is serving me correctly, were over Malmstrom. So you have that 1967 incident, and then you also have the 1975 incursions over Malmstrom. That could be one of those cases where you do see a repeat of visits, if you want to call it that. New York Times also covered these 1975 incursions in an article called the UFO Files, The Untold Story, or something to that effect. Both of those articles that I just described, the Washington Post and the New York Times article, are actually also on the CIA and I think the NSA websites. So clearly, our intelligence agencies found them interesting enough to keep, and they were released via FOIA. So if you can't find them on the New York Times website or on the Washington Post website, you can go to our trusty old U.S. government to find those articles. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt, but
no, it's okay. I will take a look at
that.
that. Yeah.
I'm doing this analysis live in my head. And I'm racking my brain for other kind of incidents where we might have had repeated incursions.
That's true. And I'll look at the dates. I'll bring up the dates probably. It just popped in my head as well when I was thinking of analysis and we were talking about nuclear. I was like, why didn't I write that question? So it just came to me instantly. So when you're looking at scientific analysis, obviously through a lens of UAP, or obviously through the lens of science, but analyzing UAP, what's your methodology and disciplines that you kind of use through what you've learned in your practice?
Yeah, so I'll separate this into kind of two buckets. The first is kind of morphologies and operational, and what have we seen where and when at what time, and what do they do? How do they operate? How do they fly? How are they reported to operate or fly or move? That's one bucket. And the other one, that's my wheelhouse. That's kind of my background, and that's just, it's interesting to me. The other one is far more, let's say, truly scientific and mathematical and technical and geometrical. And I've partnered with a couple folks, and one gentleman in particular is a bona fide climate scientist at the University of California. And we've partnered specifically on one analysis of the gimbal UFO video, which I think most people, if they don't know the name, they've certainly seen it somewhere. It's just the well-known, the quintessential saucer-shaped craft, the video it was released as part of that 2017 New York Times story. And so two buckets there, right? And both have yielded just, in the last few years that I've looked into this topic, have yielded just every step you go and every analytic step you take, it just raises 10 more questions, and you dive, 10 feet deeper or 20 feet deeper, and you just go deeper and deeper down the rabbit hole, because it becomes more and more fascinating, especially when you look back at the historical record and you compare what's happening, within the last 5-10 years to what was reported in the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s. So that's a high level overview, kind of the two buckets, the more kind of standard analytic kind of government intelligence analyst, and then the scientific mathematical geometrical analysis.
You've segued me perfectly into my next question. Recently you were on Skywatcher, and I believe it was the second episode that they've come out with this, looking at doing analysis, and you were speaking to the analysis of the various crafts. So here's something I find so interesting, at least with Skywatcher and the data that they provided. And I'd love to talk about your analysis that you did with them, because you did such a fabulous job breaking it down and how they had their own classification guide. But we see these multiple classification guides. We have AARO has one. SCU has just come out. Last year, I was at SCU, the conference, and they were talking about all the different shapes that they were seeing and what was the most consistent. And now we have Skywatcher. So everybody, here's the thing. AARO and SCU are obviously not agreeing. I believe Aguadilla is a major conversation between both SCU and AARO, and conflicting data that they have and opinions. But there also is some.
There are always opinions in the UFO story. I'll just
right. Yeah, I know it's okay. You're not right. You're never going to get away from that. But I've noticed that each of these classification guides and what we're seeing is so different. And mind you, again, it's from the area of the years that you're looking at observing, but even in the most recent. So I did reach out to Richard Powell, and that is one of the co-founders of SCU, and I asked him. I said, in the recent report that you did that came out, again, as I remember reading the report, but what was the findings again on the most top shapes? And he said disc, triangle, and oval shapes objects ranked third in frequency. He goes based on sightings that occurred within approximately 500 feet, excluding many distant spheres and appearing as mere dots in the sky, as well as most reports of lights in the sky. So really, the top objects were disc, triangles, and oval shaped objects from SCU. But I find that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because this is your area of expertise, AARO said something very different along with then Skywatcher. So I ask, what do you think of that when you hear three different kind of data banks coming out with information, and why do you think the reason is that? Obviously there could be many depending on how they're evaluating it, but when you hear that instantly, what do you think when you're hearing three different organizations have very different classification systems and what they're collecting?
Yeah, you ask a very, very good question. And the only way I can think of to answer that is to really kind of think deeply about the data sets and the data sources. What are these organizations relying on, right? So AARO, we know, is generally going to be I'm just going to speculate, overwhelmingly like infrared cameras, gun cameras on jets. I suspect that's the most common method or medium, short of radar, but that doesn't give you morphology, right? It'll just give you a blip, or you just know that there's something there. But when it comes to imagery, right, I'm assuming, again, most of the videos we see are from fighter jets and infrared in the air. Skywatcher is ground based. They're much closer. Their camera, is going to be good up to X amount of feet or meters in altitude. And I forgive me, I just don't know what the data source for SCU's morphology and kind of or morphology, whatever you want to call it, their guide. I don't know maybe it's just visual reports
I
over
believe
time.
it's visual reports, yeah, but I would
Yeah,
have to confirm that with
that's the
yeah,
only.
with Robert Powell.
It's a really interesting question, and I don't have a good answer besides just analyzing what are the data, right? What data is feeding these classification or these morphologies.
Because historically we could look back and say that, and we've had this conversation too, about historically what has been seen more, and then what do we currently see now to date, right? uh, when I'm watching Skywatcher, which I thought was a really interesting, it was very well done. It was very, very well done. And looking at it from a psionics perspective, because you're not hearing AARO or anybody else using psionics from what we know, right? And this is one of the type of ground tactics that they're using, right? They're saying that they're allegedly using. So when you hear that, and you were looking at the classification, what do you think when you hear psionics attached to this? And then also, we'll start with that, and then maybe we can get into the classification guide also that Skywatcher has put together that they feel is the most relevant shapes to date.
Yeah, and I'll just preface and say, like, if news ever broke that AARO or the U.S. government was indeed using psionic assets, I
Fair.
think it would be quite the media meltdown, right? I mean, can you imagine the headlines?
How put off
Uh,
is running it.
yeah, yeah, just complete. um,
So
so
now
and,
that's going to
and
start a
so
rumor. He's actually not,
yeah,
but
yeah, here we go. This is going to be selectively edited, and
yeah,
yeah, this is the genesis of a horrendous rumor. But
right.
so what I'll say, my personal experience, and I was only out in the field for a few days. I was unfortunately, when logistically was not able to stay for very long. But when I was out with Skywatcher, I will say, first of all, I'll just preface all of this by saying kudos to them. They have truly nation level sensor equipment, radar, infrared, electro optical, which is basically a fancy way of saying a camera. Um, and they're not content with waiting for the government to deliver things, because they know, as I know, that the government will fight tooth and nail. It's just the national security ethos, or the culture, rather, it's a better way to describe it, is to never ever share anything that you don't absolutely have to, right? And the proof is in the pudding. AARO, it has really, I think they've received, I don't know, something like 1,800 cases, something in that ballpark. I think they've put out maybe 5 videos, and they're all a joke, right? That's a pretty horrendous ratio for an organization that has pledged transparency. It's nonsense, right? Let's just call a spade a spade. So Arrow's not content to wait for the government to put stuff out. They are going out there and they're getting the data. So right off the bat, kudos to them. Incredible. And if people want to complain and be armchair, debunkers and naysayers, let them. They're not doing jack, right? These guys are actually going out there and doing it.
It's curious to you for your perspective. Did you see the psionics aspect of it, or were you there just speaking to the shapes?
Yeah, no, I most certainly did. I engaged with a few of the folks on the psionic side, or I think they're calling it neuromeditative summoning or something along those lines. I think that's the new rebranded version. But wonderful guys. But I'll just say, kind of in my experience, the psionic side and the more kind of traditional sensor side, the tech side of Skywatcher, are somewhat bifurcated,
Oh, okay, good to know.
and which is good. We want that, right? We want to
Yeah.
have some independence between those two sides. So the sensor team was up on a ridge line, and I'm not spilling any secrets because this has all been revealed on, the debunkers have already found all this stuff. So I'm not revealing anything sensitive here, but and the psionic folks were in a physically separated by quite a bit. And so I just want to preface that my interactions, my work with Skywatcher was really focused on interviewing James Fowler, who's the gentleman who runs the really the tech side. And when I say tech, I mean, again, the sensor suite, the radar, the infrared, the thermal imagery, and the really the high tech camera system that they have. So my exposure and my activity was really focused more on the tech side. I can't really speak to the psionic side. I think it's intriguing. And again, I just like you. I'd love to be sitting there as something is summoned. I tell you, if you'd asked me this question maybe 6 months ago or a year ago, I would have laughed in your face at the prospect of somebody using their mind to potentially summon one of these UAPs. But I have gone through successive, call them ontological shocks on this topic, that like you, I truly cannot in good faith dismiss anything anymore.
Yeah.
So
I'll take it
that's
as
where
a
I am.
data point,
Yeah, yeah,
I'll take it in consideration, right? Like testimony. And if we're seeing people doing this and things are actually happening, then, that's some pretty great data that you can collect.
yep.
Can we
And I'll
talk
just
about, yeah,
I'll,
no,
I'll
go
just
on.
quickly say that on the summoning side, there's also, I think James did a good job of describing this, but they have what they call a quote unquote dog whistle. So there is some technical beyond the psionic summoning side, if you want to call it. Skywatcher believes that they have a technical means of attracting, summoning, whatever you want to call it, certain objects. And in full transparency, I have not seen the underlying data. I've just seen the classes. I've seen what most people have seen publicly. But I really want to see the underlying data, and I understand why it's sensitive based on any number of factors. But the goal of Skywatcher is to get that data out to independent scientists who no attachment to the UAP topic, to analyze and to really do a deep dive into, to see what has been captured, and if there are some truly anomalous movements and traits among some of that data.
It's funny when I think back now of, like, from AARO to SCU and then to Skywatcher, how they're doing it is interesting because then it's like they're getting different data. So like, for example, we were saying like Skywatcher is using psionics, but they're also using other data collection, but they are summoning, right? Let's just say they're using some form of summoning that they're saying allegedly using. And then we have more testimony and videos and images, I believe, with SCU. And then we have like sensors on planes that are collecting this data. So there are three different ways of collecting, but we're also seeing then the classification guides are so different. Is it the element of what is being collected is what is bringing in that UAP?
Yeah,
we can't really answer that, but you know what I mean.
yeah,
It's
and
just, yeah, something to
we're
think
going into
about.
speculation territory, which is tough, right?
Exactly.
So
Yes.
and I wish I had a good answer. I honestly, I think this is why SCU and Skywatcher are so critical because they're doing this openly, right? They have committed, they have pledged. I don't want to speak for SCU, but I'm sure that everything they do is open. They've pledged
Yes.
to be transparent with their data and to get it out to scientific minds who can analyze it and make sense of it. So I suspect, and maybe in lieu of speculating, I'll just say, I'm thrilled to hear that that's the direction that these groups want to go. Let's see where it goes. I'm chomping at
I,
the bit to hear, and see where this goes.
yeah. And I would just take it as one of those things that when talking to three different groups saying, the way that you're analyzing it is we're getting similar or differences within the data and the shapes that are showing up, but they should get together and speak and talk to that and how it's collecting because it's actually fascinating of the way that they're doing it and the information that's coming back is different. So maybe we put those people in a room together and start talking and sharing analytics.
It's even more interesting. I can think of at least two historical reports, one by CIA and one by the Air Force, and one is I want to say early 1948, and the others I think 1952, right after the very well known DC sightings in the summer of 1952, and they do their own morphology. They say, hey, these are the 4 or 5 most commonly observed objects. I think in general, number one was spheres, metallic spheres or silver spheres. And you had balls of fire, right? The classic Foo Fighter. And then, there's a third document too. Sorry, there's the Twining Memo, the foundational document of UFO, kind of the government UFO study in 1947 that kind of reiterated this. And then you have the classic saucer shape. So it's interesting that you have, right, 3 different entities or morphologies and classifications currently, and then you have at least 3 that I can think of in the late 1940s and early 1950s. The earlier ones all seem to kind of gel together. There's a
Right.
consistency and coherence to the ones that the objects that were reported in the 40s and 50s, and then now you have this wide kind of breadth and scope that's interesting. And who knows, maybe I'll just be perfectly honest, I suspect that some of what Skywatcher has observed will ultimately resolve to be mundane. Some of it just inevitable, right? There is a lot of crap in the sky, but some perhaps will not. And I suspect, from what I saw, that some will not be easily debunked or have a very easy prosaic explanation.
Yeah. One could be a Chinese weather balloon to UFO to you name it. Right.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
like there's so much that's going on in the skies right now, more
That's
than
right.
people imagine. Right. And also just within space, like it's just there's how many satellites out there too. Like there's
Exactly.
so much. Now, people that are listening are probably saying, Chrissy, ask him what the classifications are so we can break them down. Skywatcher's classifications, because they are a little bit different that we were speaking about compared to other people. And what are their findings?
So I'll maybe focus on the 2 or 3 that got the most kind of attention in episode 2. And number 1, I think, is the Tic Tac. And I think most people know the Tic Tac shape from that 2004 incident. And according to Skywatcher, these were observed dropping rapidly, potentially from space, via their sensor equipment. And there's video of that in episode 2. Then there was the jellyfish, which is very interesting, right? So you have this kind of larger, call it a head structure, and then these trailing appendages, if you will, that appeared to illuminate. I know the skeptics are screaming, "That's a balloon! That's a balloon! That's a balloon!" That's easily, that's easily assessed if we know the date and time of and location of the videos that are presented. We can go back and do and the radar tracks. We can do a very basic wind analysis, and if they're moving with the wind, well, chances are these are balloons. If they're moving against the wind or perpendicular to the wind, as James Fowler of Skywatcher indicated to me was the case. I think that was in the episode. Then they're probably not balloons, and then the plot thickens, right? So, and then I think they also showed the blob. They called it the blob. It's just this pinkish, fuzzy looking Pepto-Bismol colored
Right, we're getting so creative
round
with our
object.
shapes.
Yeah, yeah. And again, I know the skeptics are screaming, yeah, that's a reddish or pink mylar balloon viewed at a distance, and it distorts the imagery. Okay, well, same thing. This is why we need competent, objective, scientific analysis of the data. They have radar tracks. We know the date, the time, location. We can do a wind analysis. We can go back and look at the wind data. And if that thing is screaming against the wind, we've got an anomaly, right? So I think those are the three that were really highlighted in that first, in episode 2 of Skywatcher. So maybe I'll leave it there before I bore the audience to tears. But there's more coming, as I understand it. So yes, stay tuned.
That's great. Yeah. And the jellyfish, I think, is interesting. Someone that works in defense formerly did message me. I met him, gosh, about 2 or 3 years ago. And he's not someone that's generally very public in this space. I think he was at one point with a few groups, but not recently. And when the jellyfish came out, he called me right away and was like, there's this folklore. And I don't know, and maybe I'm wrong, but the folklore hasn't really been spoken about on the base. This jellyfish object has been seen for years, and it has a folklore around it, and that multiple people and different people working on the base have reported seeing this. So it's not like this was the first time. There's been multiple accounts.
So, and just so so we're clear, I think you might be referring to, there was a quote unquote jellyfish video which was recorded, I think, over Iraq.
But there's the maybe
Remember
sorry, you are right that I'm wrong. And then there was a specific base that there's been told that there's this rumor of
Yep.
of a jellyfish. But
Yeah.
but maybe it could have been Iraq, depending, because I know that the person was out there, was serving at that point in time and was on that
Yeah.
base. And that's why I
Yeah.
know. So potentially it could have been Iraq that he was there. And it probably more than likely could have been at some
Yeah.
point. If that was, I believe it was an American base, then but there is a folklore attached to this
Yeah.
whole jellyfish thing.
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up, because there was it made waves. Jeremy Corbell, who and George Knapp, who I've had the privilege of working with just over the last couple weeks on another video, which is super interesting. They released that. Gosh, I want to say maybe about a year ago. It's just this kind of like gangly looking thing that just kind of cruises over a base. It's recorded
It's wild. Yeah.
in infrared. Funny enough, AARO, the government's UFO analysis office, debunked that video just 2 days
Right.
ago, I think, or recently. So, and interestingly enough, they put out the debunk on Twitter or X or whatever you want to call it, literally as Corbell and Knapp's interview with one of the new whistleblowers, Matthew Brown, was airing, like 5 minutes into that interview. It's just the timing is remarkable for some of this stuff. But yes, just very quickly back to your point, in bringing this truly full circle, Matthew Brown, this new whistleblower, who alleges that this program called Immaculate Constellation was operating and secretly kind of intercepting and squirreling away and hiding and sequestering and segregating UFO imagery. He wrote a report that went out to Congress.
Right.
And at the bottom of that report, there's another list of morphologies, another classification guide, if you will. And one of those subheadings is organics, and it explicitly describes jellyfish-like objects and structures. So we're coming full circle on money, which happens all too often in the UFO topic. But there's another list, another morphology, and another classification guide for you. They seem to be coming fast and furious these days.
It's unbelievable. Well, we're seeing this evolution of UAP that we have not seen before or have just not seen in the mainstream yet, which is really interesting. Now, with the recent whistleblower, he's saying he's putting his life on the line. He could be in jail. What's your perception of that? Obviously working with defense, and what is the likeliness that he will?
Yeah. So, and again, this is part of my own journey. I'll just say, if you asked me that question 5, 6 years ago, I would have said that guy is insane. He's a lunatic. I don't know what his problem is. Today, my bias is to trust but verify to the extent that we can. The number of whistleblowers that have now come out between David Grush, Elizondo, Carl Nell, Matt Brown, Jake Barber, all these folks, there just seems to be this building critical mass. And from my perspective, I don't see an upside to these folks coming out, right? There's a reputational hit that they take. They take a financial hit. Elizondo famously lived in a trailer right after he left government. He gave up a pension and was
He was
retaliated
digging
against.
his own septic tank.
Correct,
Mm.
exactly. There's no upside to coming out. So I'll just say this about the new whistleblower Matthew Brown. He presents to me, and maybe I'm biased, and I got to, if I'm going to be a good analyst, I have to check my own biases. But he presents to me as thoughtful, credible, and genuine. And the Pentagon, of course, has denied all this, which is not surprising. They would have, either way, they would have denied this. So look, this just begs and screams of investigation. Unfortunately, it seems like until we see evidence that the government's UFO analysis office, AARO, is more objective, which it has not been under the previous director. There's some hope that it will be more objective, but unless and until we see more evidence that they are truly objective, it's up to Congress to do this kind of work. And unfortunately, they just seem to have abdicated that responsibility. It's, there's too much going on DC these days. I don't know if people have been following the news. There's a lot of activity that is sucking the oxygen out of the entire city of DC. There's a lot going on there. So it's not entirely surprising. But, just to very quickly answer your question, that this gentleman, Matthew Brown, fears potentially going to prison or worse, as he's alleged. I do not dismiss that, as insane as it sounds. I do believe that there's a there, and I will just quickly reiterate Senator Marco Rubio, now Secretary of State, now National Security Advisor, now I think he's got 4 hats, but he was the Vice Chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, and he stated in just this extraordinary interview. This is in, I want to say, June or July of 2023. He said openly that some of these people, credible, thoughtful, very smart, and very high positions with high clearances, they fear for their lives. That's what Rubio said in this remarkable NewsNation interview. Kirk McConnell, who is I think a 37-year veteran of staffer in Congress, has said the same thing. He interviewed, and members of Congress interviewed a witness who was physically shaking with fear at the prospect of disclosing what he was about to disclose. So look, when you apply an analytic framework, this is not the only time that we've heard of people fearing for their lives or fearing worse. Grush has alleged brutal retaliation. Lou, I think, has also alleged the same. So this is a very, very long-winded way of saying it's frightening. I do take it seriously.
Yeah, I agree. And it should be, no matter what. When anyone says that they're worried for their life, they should be taken seriously in any degree, right? Um, especially if they don't have a past of consistently doing this and making false accusations. With Matthew
Correct.
Brown, though, I think is really interesting for the fact that if they make an example of him, then it's the confirmation that this existed, right? That these documents existed and these things are happening. Um, and then if they don't, then they're not going by their own, right, federal government rules. So in their own government rules and in national security. So it's a really tricky space. And then you also know that if they do prosecute him, then there will be so many people advocating for him, right? And it will
Yeah,
become
absolutely. It's a
more
big story.
international than it already has. I'd say
Right.
this is probably, it's international for sure. Don't get me wrong, but it will blow up around the world, and you will see people advocating around the world for him. So the government's in a really tricky spot right now.
Bit of a catch-22, right? Damned if you do and damned if you don't. Right. What I will say, and I've only seen part one of Jeremy Corbell and George Knapp's interview with Matthew Brown, and from what I saw, there's much more to come. I have no idea what it contains, but in part one, this is just a bit of a government nuance that I'm going into here, but bear with me. I understood that he came across information. I think it was like a slide deck or something like that. By chance, he was going through documents in a shared drive, in a classified shared drive, and he was accidentally exposed to something without classification markers. So that gets into a gray area, right? If he was not formally read into this program, and if he discovered it, it's a little grushy in here. That's when it gets a little squirrely, and we don't know, right? But again, if I Marik, or you Chrissy are read into program, you name a program, a blue plate. I'm just making this up, right? And you're read into that. You sign the paperwork. You say, "I will not talk about blue plate." That's when you face potential criminal legal sanction if you do violate that oath. So it is interesting, and that's a legal question that we don't need to litigate here. But I really am curious to see what parts 2 and 3 of his interview, what those look like, and what he
Right.
reveals.
Because right now would be the government would just say, well, that's not true, you know, and
And that's
would
what you
just
have stuff.
push him off,
Yeah,
right? That would be the easiest thing to do. But they're probably holding their breath for the other parts as well before they make, I would hope Susan Goff and the rest of them are holding their breath to see what is going to be released next for them to even make a statement if they do.
that's
And
right.
then what kind of, if he feels that he was going against some type of national security and releasing this
Yeah,
information, then we'll see what the outcome is. But
that's right.
it's a wild, wild time right now. That's for sure. It
Can I?
always gets more and more interesting every year. Like I can't wait until I'm 60. We'll see what happens.
Where are we? Yeah, exactly.
you know.
If I could just briefly editorialize a little bit, and I'm sorry, but
Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
I with the succession, excuse me, of whistleblowers that have come out over the last several years. I find it astounding, shameful, and from my perspective, infuriating that there's not been a single mainstream media article about Matthew Brown coming forward on Tuesday. Nothing, as far as I know. I think the Daily Mail covered it, but beyond that, nothing. And that is journalistic malpractice, malfeasance, even if it's all nonsense, right? These are fascinating stories that deserve some level of coverage and attention. And I don't know if that's stigma. I don't know if that is an intentional decision in newsrooms. There's just lack of interest, or perhaps just more likely there's just so much other stuff going on in the world that it sucks up the oxygen. But outside of this podcast and the world of Twitter and maybe the UFO Reddit. This is touching maybe 1% of the population, 2%, and for a story that has, even if there's I'm just going to go back in history here. There in the George W. Bush administration, there's something called the 1% doctrine, and that said that if there was a 1% chance of a terrorist attack, we got to treat it as a certainty. Well, you can apply that to some respect here. If there's a 1% chance of this UFO story being true, and I would humbly submit that it is greater than 1% from my perspective, it deserves enormous scrutiny and some serious digging and journalistic, journalistic firepower and attention, and it has not gotten any of that. So sorry for the rant, but
No, I think that's great. And we can end this
yeah.
part of it saying, I'll say to that, I do agree for sure. I think that journalism needs to look at this a little bit better than they have, kind of just pushing it off from what we're imagining. They've just pushed it off. And haven't done their own due diligence. Maybe they have. But I will say, Elaine Cooper, when the 2017 piece came out with the New York Times with Ralph Blumenthal and Leslie Kean, when I was speaking to Christopher Mellon, and I've interviewed him about his past experiences, releasing that information. And we actually did I should release it at one point in time. I actually used it for a presentation at a conference to talk about the mechanics behind how you do that, because it's fascinating, right? It really is. And what I found out was interesting is that Elaine Cooper really didn't care about the UAP. She really cared about the earmark. So I think back then, yeah. And so even then it was just like, well, we just care about the black op money, right? We care about that. UFOs kind of just go with it. So, and we're seeing that specifically from the New York Times. Historically, the New York Times has been known to report this from a balanced perspective from the research that I've done, right? It might be in a little section. It might not be, put all over the paper, but it did report on many different things when it came to books, segments and things that were happening. Like, they were pretty balanced in their reporting. So now, the reason why that I feel that maybe, and this is when I put on more of my PR hat than a journalism hat, but my PR spirit tells me that the reason that the news stations are not taking it and the journalists are not taking it from the New York Times or Politico or anywhere else is they feel that the way it's being done and how it's being disseminated, they probably feel that disseminating things through YouTube or through podcasts are probably not credible enough. Not saying they're not. I'm like, we're on a podcast right now, but right. But I think that's probably why, right? And I would curious to know and talk to Jeremy Corbell and George Knapp if they went to the New York Times and if they went to the Washington Post or they went to other outlets outside of NewsNation, because they are the lead reporter for sure in UAP when it comes to broadcast. But I would wonder if that is because they would want to do their own vetting. We know that when we released the David Grush piece, right? We vetted our own, but we even re-vetted what the Washington Post vetted, right? So I think that's why they want to do their own vetting and they want their own more time to do it. And if they find anything significantly not a reliable source, they axe it. And it's not that I disagree with that. Yep. I think that you have to be very discerning in what you tell people. When we released David Grush, I literally said to the guys, I do care about Sally down the street and what she's going to think, and should I really care? Yeah, I do. I care because what we report really does shape what people believe and what they believe about themselves and how they see themselves and their perception of the world, right? And people can believe almost anything, if you can, and a lot of people are gullible and a lot of people their minds change very quickly. I see it with friends, people I know, their mind about anything can change instantly with new data, which is smart, or instantly with someone else's opinion, which I don't think is the best thing. So that's probably why, but it doesn't mean that I think that large outlets should be looking at this and doing it, but I think it's how the information is being disseminated. That would be my only response to that, I think, from them and seeing it on the back end. My last thing I'll say is I did talk to some people at CBS. I won't say who, but there is obviously some battles when it comes to broadcast. And I will say one person did an interview on Fox and it would have been more of an exclusive and it wasn't given to CBS. They decided to go to Fox and CBS was just like, nope, we're not doing this topic anymore. And I heard that directly from producers. Yeah. So they changed their mind after a little bit, but for a while there, it was like, we're not doing this because now it's gone to our competitor. Right. So it gets political in the broadcast space. I know. And I think I don't agree with that. Like, I don't at all. And this is not to hit on, I don't work for Fox. I don't work for CBS. But it's not to hit on them. The choices of what they do. They obviously need ratings to keep the news going. I get it. But I do respect though that CBS did go back. They took a break from the topic, but they did go back to it as well. So they didn't, I think they were just disheartened that they didn't have that story when it was offered to them potentially first.
That
But
makes complete
yeah,
sense.
it's such a hard game, but I do agree with you. It should be looked at. But I would hope that other journalists would, if they're not from Corbell and Knapp, that they are working with those outlets like Leslie Cannon and Ralph Blumenthal, because we have to work
Yeah,
together. There's no point of being at odds at this point, because once you're at odds, your
absolutely.
data is just going to get poo-pooed over anyway. People aren't going to listen. You might be segregated into, you know, more different ideals. It could be pushed into extremist ideals. You never know. And it also becomes personalized. When in case one of them do something wrong, they're not journalists. George Knapp is a journalist. Jeremy McGraw is an investigative, I wouldn't call him journalist, but he's a filmmaker, right? So I think that you need groups of people in a larger industry to be able to push it to create that credibility. But that's my end
Yeah.
rant.
No, it's good. I don't disagree with any of that. I think I'll just add quickly. I think it's obvious, but I think the stigma and the nature of the UFO topic are so ingrained. We're talking about decades long that the editorial threshold to run with something is going to be higher just by the nature of the topic, right? That's fine. Um, Frankly, I am shocked. That said, that caveat aside, I am shocked that the Post, for example, the Washington Post, um, well, I guess if I understand, and I truly don't know the inside baseball here, but I understand that they just wanted more time to vet the story.
Correct. That's correct. Yeah.
From a government perspective, if and Grush had the former Inspector General of the intelligence community as his attorney, that alone and I'm not a journalist, I'm not an editor, but that alone sold me on that story, and I don't know why the Post didn't run it on that basis alone, right? Having that the gentleman and individual of that stature, the first intelligence community inspector general, again as Grush's attorney, that's incredible firepower. That's star power right there, legal star power that I struggle to make sense of why the Post didn't run. But I'm never going to I can't second guess, but that's just going to throw that out there. It's a government technicality, but it is that's when I sat up and paid attention
It's
to that
true. And
story.
allegedly, like from what Leslie Kane said to me when I did the interview with both Ralph Blumenthal and Leslie after the story broke, I think it was the next day I did the interview with them and talked about how they vetted it and if they were, worried about disinformation and spreading it. But the interesting part is when I asked Leslie about did she know about David Grush and the other aspects of the things that he reported to NewsNation, and she said no to me. So, if we're going to take Leslie's word, she didn't know. So that means then the Washington Post wouldn't have known that. Or if the Washington Post found
Good
out
point.
about the other comments about the Vatican, they probably would have went, heck no. That's the reason we didn't know what it is. And that was one of the
Yeah.
reasons we ran with it. So I do agree. Like I still think like, it's a great story that we put out. And I'm not saying that the data's not there and the right people weren't making the right like Carl now. I'm not going to say he's not a person that should be speaking on the record about this. He's one of the best. But
Right.
it was the fact that I think that if the Washington Post, and we don't know, this is speculation, if they knew about anything else about the Vatican and the other references that New Nation was coming
Yeah.
forward, they probably would have ran away from that. And
Fair point.
like I might have too, right?
Yeah.
You can't make those claims. And as much as I love Ross, like, Ross and I know each other, it's hard to make those claims, but it is testimony too. And that is important, right?
Yep.
So,
No.
you know,
Spot on.
exactly. So it's like, how do you debate it? And now and those things are really happening and people are dying, and we've heard other people say this for years. This is not the first time we've heard this, but now it's the first time someone from intelligence has really put that on the record. So it's important, but we just need to start clearing away all the caca now and hopefully getting to more points.
I'll say one quick thing, and
For sure, Eric.
I want to leave folks with this, and this is I
Yeah.
think this is the way I view this, and this is we're in a binary kind of world right now, and Secretary of State Rubio said this right. He said either we're dealing with the biggest story in human history, or we have highly credible, intelligent, well-spoken people with high clearances entrusted to do very important things for our government who are insane and crazy. And oh, by the way, many of them are not public. Many of the people that drove Congress's investigation, the incredible legislation that we saw being proposed by Chuck Schumer and Mike Rounds and so on, are not public. That alone, right? It's one or the other. And it's either way, it's a huge story, which that alone should be red meat for any media organization. All right, rant done.
I agree. I do. And I say the same thing. I agree. There's a couple Looney Tunes, no matter what, you're going to get them. But this is a story that just hasn't happened for the past 10 years. It's been going on for more than 75 years, right? Or longer, right? Or the existence since we've known civilization. So, you can't tell me that's not a story. So
That's right.
thank you so much, Marik. And thank you for being rebelliously curious with me today.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you. Thanks. That was great. Thanks.